about this for a second. A single stroke of a pen in a quiet, fancy room in 19th century Berlin. And then, more than 100 years later and half a world away, that same line helps ignite a civil war. This is the story of a butterfly effect, but on a massive, continental scale. It's about how a map, drawn by men who'd never even seen the land they were carving up, would end up planting the seeds of violence for generations to come. Welcome to Insight History HD. Together, we will peel back the layers of narratives long locked away in the archives of history. Now, that quote you're looking at uses a very specific phrase, political fragmentation. It really gets to the heart of what happened here. This wasn't just about conquest. It was about forcing a completely foreign system onto a place, a system that just wasn't compatible with the human geography it was trying to control. So our story doesn't actually begin on African soil. It starts in the very quiet, very formal halls of a government building in Berlin during the winter of 1884. It's here, totally insulated from the lands they were about to divide, that the fate of millions was going to be decided by men who saw Africa not as a home, but as a concept. So you had 14 nations meeting, and their real motivation wasn't so much about a vision for Africa, but more about a fear of each other. This scramble for Africa had gotten completely out of hand, and Germany's chancellor, Otto von Bismarck, his real goal was just to manage the rivalries in Europe. On this huge chessboard, the continent of Africa was the prize, and its people, well, they weren't even considered players in the game. You know, the guest list itself tells you so much. You see all the big powers of the time: Germany, Great Britain, France, even the United States. But the most powerful statement, really, is about who wasn't there. For 3 months, they negotiated the future of Africa, and not a single African voice was in that room. An entire continent's destiny was being drawn on a map by men who basically saw it as an empty space to be filled. All right, so if you're going to legitimize carving up an entire continent, you have to come up with some rules for it. The question in Berlin was never if Africa should be colonized, but simply how it could all be managed without starting a war back in Europe. And the cornerstone of this whole new system was something called the doctrine of effective occupation. What it meant was you couldn't just plant a flag on a coast anymore and claim everything behind it. Now, you had to officially tell the other powers what you were claiming, and you had to prove you actually had some administrative control there. It was basically an attempt to turn a chaotic land grab into a predictable, bureaucratic process. And here's how it looked in practice. First, explorers would get a local leader to sign a treaty, which was often in a language the leader couldn't even read, usually offering so-called protection. Then, that piece of paper would get sent back to Europe, and it became the legal basis for taking over the land. Its legitimacy didn't come from the people living there, but from the other colonizers agreeing to it. So, with all the rules of the game set in Europe, the consequences on the ground in Africa were immediate and just catastrophic. This paper-pushing exercise in Berlin was about to become a violent new reality for millions of people. And this is where you find the central tragic irony of the whole Berlin Conference. For Europe, it worked. They avoided a major war over colonies. But that peace in Europe was basically bought with African conflict. The lines they drew on their maps just ignored all the deep-rooted ethnic, linguistic, and social realities. And in doing so, they planted the seeds for a century of war. You know, maybe no other image shows the sheer scale of this disruption quite like this one. On the one side, you see Africa before 1884, this complex mosaic of independent kingdoms and societies. And then, just 30 years later, you see a continent just shattered into a collection of European colonies. It's one of the fastest and most brutal transformations of political geography in all of human history. Let this number sink in for a moment. In 1870, only about 10% of Africa was under European control. By 1914, that number had jumped to 90%. 90. In the span of just one generation, an entire continent was claimed and carved up. And it's so important to remember, these were not empty lands. As we know from historical analyses, this new European map was laid right on top of 1,000 distinct cultures and regions. With just the stroke of a pen, entire societies that worked as a whole were cut in two, while groups that were historic rivals suddenly found themselves stuck inside the same artificial border. That colonial map wasn't just going to disappear when independence finally came. Its lines, drawn in ink a century before, were now etched into the political landscape. They would become the fault lines for conflicts that are still going on today. This timeline really shows you how durable these colonial creations were. You go from the Berlin Act in 1885 to the partition being pretty much done by 1914. But the really critical moment comes later, in 1964. The brand new Organization of African Unity makes this agonizing choice to keep the colonial borders because they were terrified that trying to redraw them would just ignite endless wars all across the continent. And now, the consequences aren't just a historical theory anymore. We have the data. According to a 2015 study called The Long-Run Effects of the Scramble for Africa, there is a direct, measurable link. It found that ethnic groups that were partitioned are, and I quote, systematically discriminated against, and are more likely to participate in ethnic civil wars. This is where that butterfly effect becomes undeniable. The research shows that the homelands of these divided groups aren't just unlucky, they systematically experience more violence and more severe violence. They're more likely to have civil wars and to be invaded. And for the individuals living there, it means less access to things like schools and public services. The flutter of a butterfly's wings in Berlin really did become a hurricane of instability. And this isn't just an abstract statistic. It's the lived reality for millions. Take the Somali people, for instance. They were split across 5 different colonial territories. The nomadic Tuareg people found their ancestral lands suddenly divided by the new borders of countries like Mali and Niger. In case after case, these arbitrary lines became the fuel for decades and decades of conflict. So this brings us to the central dilemma for modern Africa. If these lines on the map are the source of the problem, why not just erase them and start over? Well, the answer, just like the history that created it, is incredibly complex. The post-colonial leaders were caught in an impossible situation. They inherited a map that was literally designed for their oppression, but they chose to keep it. They did this under a legal principle called uti posseditus, which basically means as you possess, so you may possess. The terrible logic was that a flawed piece, built on the flawed borders of their colonizers, was still better than the absolute chaos that would erupt if every group tried to reclaim their pre-colonial land all at once. The story of the Berlin Conference is just this stark reminder that decisions made in insulated rooms can echo for generations, creating realities their architects never, ever have to live through. It forces us to ask, what invisible lines, political, economic, digital, are being drawn on the maps of our world today, and whose voices, once again, are absent from the room? A map is not the territory, but it can become its cage. If this journey has offered you a new perspective, support our exploration by subscribing to Insight History HD. Thank you for listening, and I will see you in the next narrative.